I please ask all the panel to come on the podium? Thank you.
Good afternoon, or good evening, I should say, good morning. For those of us who are from New York, London, Singapore is the same time zone as this almost. It may be evening, but good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Clay Maitland. I'm the moderator of this panel. And our panel today, as you can see, is entitled Geopolitical, Regulatory, and Market Trends Affecting Shipping. I've been warned that time is limited and we're going to try to move ahead very rapidly. So at the risk of disconcerting the members of the panel, and I hope that the members of the panel are alert to all of this, I'm not going to give long introductions, and I'm also not going to go over all of the things that we all discussed by email over the last 2 weeks. I'm just going to allude, I may misquote you, but I'm going to just say a few words about each of you now, including Mr. Batra, who is standing and going to show us some very interesting slides prepared by E.V. Drewry. And I may misquote you, but I will at least, I think, open the floor to discussion in a more meaningful way. On my immediate left is Joe Hughes. Joe is the chairman of the Shipowners Mutual P&I Club, as I call it. I know that's a misquotation, but it's the American club. There's nothing very American about the American club, as those of us who know the American club will know. It's a very global P&I club. Next, Mr. Batra, who is actually standing here getting ready to show his slides, is the Group Managing Director of Drewry Shipping Consultants Limited. Then Vincent Li Ping Kwong, again I hope I have your name more or less correct in both versions, is the Regional Business Development Manager for China of the Class Society DNV GL. Finally, on the far left, Mr. Zhuang is Regional Manager for Asia of BIMCO. And finally, and last but not least, Tim Wilkins, Regional Manager and Environmental Director for Asia Pacific, a very small geographical area of INTERTANKO. So we have two non-governmental organizations here, very famous ones, BIMCO and INTERTANKO, represented. It's a very mixed group of people. This panel appears again and again at Capital Link, and sometimes called the Gloom and Doom panel. I hope today it will not be known for gloom and doom. Geopolitical and regulatory trends and market trends have not been particularly easy to navigate for us in the industry, but we hope today to be able to give a brief synopsis, a little bit different from what you've heard, of where we see the industry going and where the problems lie ahead. Yes, CO2 emissions. Yes, the Paris Agreement. Yes, the worldwide entry into force, whenever it really takes effect, of the Ballast Water Management Convention, the sulfur cap. These are simple considerations, but very complicated for the industry. Mr. Hughes is going to speak on the cyber risks in general and the implications of cyber attacks. I think I'm correct in saying that. I'm greatly shortening your remit, but given the time limitations, there it is. Mr. Batra is going to speak on trade protectionism, nationalism, globalism, the new political divide, and whether we might need fewer ships. Mr. Wilkins of INTERTANKO and I had breakfast this morning, and we talked about the availability and training of qualified seafarers and maybe the implication of how maritime regulations are drafted and implemented, and how the world might do a better job in not only drafting the regulations, but in enforcing them. Maybe the question of a level playing field is the best way to describe it. Zhuang has expressed concerns over data available on available fuel and how that data is arrived at with regard, of course, to the global sulfur cap implementation. And finally, BIMCO generally has been a leader in producing standard contracts as well as clauses for the shipping industry, And the flood tide of regulation has had an effect on that and will have an effect on those regulations. And perhaps Mr. Wei can say a few words about that. So there we are. I haven't forgotten Vincent. Vincent Ping is going to ask this question, I think, putting words in your mouth, Vincent. Do we retrofit? Do we upgrade? Do we scrap? Or do we purchase new ships? And we'll talk a little bit, perhaps, I hope, today about something you don't hear so much about as much as we did last year, the Echo ship. With that, I would like to turn the floor over to Mr. Batra. Mr. Batra and Drewry, very famous firm of consultants, and I'm happy to say that my company has used you as consultants in the distant past, has, and I want you to watch these slides very carefully during the 4 or 5 minutes that you're going to see them. He said two things that hit me in the eye when I looked at the slides. One is, he said, the world needs to adjust to a new phase of economic growth, which is evidently lower than its heyday seen before the subprime crisis of 2008. Is lower demand for shipping the new normal? I hope I'm not going too fast for the translators. I almost forgot. Now, with that, having made a number of serious mistakes and gaffes, I'll turn this over to you, Arjun.
Thank you, Clay. Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, Caplink, for inviting me. I have 12 slides, and I was given 5 minutes, I think.
I've used that up already.
So I'm not going to figure out. Luckily for me, a lot of what I need to say in detail has already been said. I'm going to take a very macro helicopter view of the global economy and the impact on shipping. Clearly, we've been seeing a lot about geopolitical, globalization, etc. It's in the news every day, so we just cannot miss it. Clearly, I think what is very, very clear, globalization over the last 20 years has been great economic benefit for all of us. All the global economies have done extremely well. But in the developed world, there is a subsection of society which has suffered due to globalization, and this has had ramifications. We've seen Brexit, we've seen Trump, now Le Pen. There have been lots of TPP being renegotiated or getting out of, US and with China emerging as a global leading power, the US-China competition, whatever we want to call it. Clearly, this has ramifications on trade. And this is a chart of WTO notifications. What you're seeing here is 2016 as a sort of peak in WTO notifications, which is really people complaining about trade in some form or the other. So going forward, trade protectionism is going to be a topic. Next mega trend we are seeing clearly is the digital revolution. It's all around us. We've seen it, we've benefited it. There's manufacturing technology, miniaturization, all these online platforms disintermediating traditional marketplaces, Airbnb, Uber. We're just seeing a lot of traditional markets being disseminated. Artificial intelligence coming through. Yeah, all of this is changing how the global economy is working. Clay mentioned the new normal GDP growth, although in the short term it is improving, but what we are seeing really is global growth trending at a new normal, much lower than what we saw in the first decade of this century. So I think we have to come to terms, growth is going to be lower than before. But actually, another very significant part of this trend is we are having lower population growth. We're using less steel per GDP growth. We're using less energy per GDP growth. And the energy mix is moving very rapidly to clean technology, clean energy, so away from fossil fuel. You can look at the ramifications of this across the board. And I just summarize it in this chart. Lower economic growth, lower population growth, lower steel intensity, lower energy intensity, trade protectionism, digital revolution, all of it net there's going to be a new normal, lower growth in shipping demand. Next, I'm sure all my colleagues are going to be, and most of the day, talk of new regulations in shipping, net, higher costs for ship owners, higher operating costs. Interest costs, we've had a decade of low to near zero interest costs, US dollar, that has bottomed out, US dollar LIBOR is moving upward. How fast, we can debate, but we know the direction is going to be up. Operating costs going up for ship owners, at least borrowing costs going up for ship owners. And lastly, and not least, we've been touched upon before, there's still huge amounts of shipbuilding capacity waiting to be used, ship owners to go out there and contract. So net, just summing up all these mega trends, what is happening? Trade barriers, lower growth in shipping volumes, increased operating costs, increased interest costs, huge shipbuilding costs, capacity. So net, now my view is that shipping one way or the other is going to be predominantly oversupplied going forward. It will give lower long-term returns in investments. Peaks there will be, but they will be short-lived. There will be volatility. So for an investor in shipping, just investing and going away is not the solution. We have to look at volatility, play the volatility, play the capital markets by buying and selling ships at the right time. You know, buy at the right time, sell at the right time. Gentlemen, ladies, thank you very much.
Thank you, Arjun. Congratulations. All right, Mr. Batra, you've laid the challenge down to us. When is the right time? And I'm going to ask Mr. Wilkins at the end, I believe, of INTERTANKO to speak next on when do you think the right time is, and where do you see the big issues as representative of one of the major NGOs, shipping organizations?
Yeah, thank you, Clay, and thank you, Arjun, for the introduction. I think it was interesting to note that most speakers have touched upon some of the environmental issues today, because you know, if we look at the top 7 issues that INTERTANKO are facing with, the top 2 of those are environmentally focused. The Ballast Water Convention and the 2020 discussion of fuel availability and quality discussion. I'll start with a slightly overriding comment, because Clay suggested I should talk about the regulations. Now, I think overriding what we're seeing, because we're up at this sort of level now, talking about these impending legislative changes, one for this year and one for 2020, I think what we must remember is that the regulatory process perhaps needs some form of consideration in the future. I think it needs to be potentially overhauled. Our members certainly spend a lot of time considering how to implement these new pieces of legislation. And I would say 2 things to the regulators, and then I'll talk about these 2 issues. Very briefly, I think we need to move away from setting idealistic targets without full consideration of the practical realities of those targets. The second point is the assigning of full liability for the implementation of these targets and these regulatory requirements is always assigned to the ship owner. I think more responsibility needs to be assigned to the other parties that are responsible for not just environmental legislation, but safety legislation as well. And what I'm talking about here is the regulator at the port state, the governing bodies that are responsible for enforcing it. Okay, so that's my little mantra. I'll get off my soapbox now, and I'll talk about two challenges that we see. We have what we consider to be a doom and gloom panel, but actually there are some practical side of things, and there's some practical things that we can do. And what we're doing at INTERTANKO for and on behalf of our members is ensuring that we have practical guidance out there to implement both the Ballast Water Convention and the 2020 low sulfur fuel requirements. If we look at the ballast water side of things first, we challenged the IMO. We challenged the IMO with this 2017 date. When we came out of 2016, we had put on the table the concept that our members and the industry at large needed additional time. This wasn't a classic dragging of feet from the industry. This is a practical reality. We have 2 pieces of legislation in place. The IMO's legislation, which has just moved the goalposts with a new type approval regime for ballast water treatment systems, And then we have the second unilateral legislation in the US. If an owner is going to invest, as we heard from Henrietta, $500,000 to $1.5 million in a new ballast water treatment systems, you want that system to work, and you want that system to be compliant now and in the future with any regulatory regime. So it's only fair to suggest that actually maybe we should be giving them maybe an extra year or two. So maybe 2017 will not be the implementation date for this convention. Let's see in July. On the 2020 discussion, well, again, let's talk about the practical implementation side of things. What can we do to assist the industry? Now, let's take away the commercial and financial discussions that we're going to have, scrubbers versus LNGs, for example, and talk about the enforcement, the compliance. We saw when ECAs came into force in 2015 and the shift to 0.1%, we saw about 5-month delay in all the major bunker delivery ports in the world, making sure they had sufficient and ample supply. We can anticipate something similar when it comes to 2020. And I think what we've got to do is ensure that the regulators and the enforcers, whether that's through IMO or on a regional basis, are aware of that and aware of the predicament that they're putting the ship owners in. Maybe some form of soft entry or practical entry into force is going to be required. Those are my two sort of opening gambits. Clay, I'm sorry it took a little bit longer than I thought.
By the way, I'd like to encourage, thanks Tim very much, I would like to encourage the members of the panel to question one another and to react to one another's statements. We'd like to keep this as sort of a free-flowing discussion and not simply, and this, by the way, was Tim's suggestion, that we try to talk to each other about some of these things while we're up here in the few minutes we have left. I would like to ask Joe to, in view of what you just heard, I realize that you're going to talk about something entirely different, a little bit like Monty Python, I think. Now for something entirely different. We're going to get from you a P&I Club executive's version of what's going to happen.
Well, you're very kind, actually, Claire. I didn't think that I looked like John Cleese, actually, but perhaps I do.
Don't mention the war.
Don't mention the war, no, indeed. Well, thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure to be here. And Arjun, you referred to the subject of digitalization, which I take to mean the impact of information technology on the larger global scene. And that is what I'm going to try and speak about very briefly. Those that know me well, such as you, Clay, will have a reaction of unbridled hilarity mixed with silent awe at the fact that I am engaging in the subject of information technology, in the sense that my previous career hasn't been distinguished by a towering command of IT issues, but obviously if I'm talking about it, I must have learned a great deal in a very short period of time. But I would say this, it is obviously a very important dimension to everything that we're increasingly doing in shipping, and it has insurance implications, of course. The world of big data and connectivity brings with it obviously great opportunity in the sense of the use of big data to improve shipping activity, the use of blockchain technology, for example. Is this actually working? Can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Oh, right, good, okay. To improve various aspects of logistics. The use of AI to create autonomous shipping. I understand that there's a general belief in the shipping industry at the moment that that is indeed possible, but of course that the world isn't quite ready for it. And in that particular context, from a P&I and insurance perspective, the question of what liability regimes you'd apply in regard to unmanned ships is of course very important going forward. The downsides obviously are there too, the multiplication of the potential for cyber risks, and so far as cover is concerned in regard to cyber risks, the marine insurance dimension to these growing trends. And I have to say that the issue of cyber risk as such has been a focus of our industry, I think, only relatively recently, but it has become a very large concern. From the marine insurance perspective, if there is an accidental cyber incident created by a hacking event or something of that kind that is not motivated by a war or terrorism intention, then most hull and P&I policies will cover the consequences of that in the ordinary way. if there is a cyber risk created or a loss created by a cyber attack that is motivated as part of an act of war or an act of terrorism, then of course that doesn't apply in the ordinary way to cover available under most war risk policies. There is a specific exclusion under those policies for such things. And I think that the industry generally, because there haven't been many of these attacks or these incidents that have taken place in recent years, is somewhat behind the curve in developing responses to that. But I think that on the regulatory front, the spectre of growing cyber risk will create an expansion, perhaps, of international regulation, more regulation in regard to the manner in which ship owners are expected.
This gentleman is gesturing.
I know he is.
I can hear you through the microphone, but apparently...
What's that?
Is the mic off?
I was told that it's on, actually.
Maybe you should just hold it closer. It's definitely on. Now you sabotage your own microphone. So,
Well, why don't I use yours,
Yeah,
Clay?
okay, go ahead.
So I don't know where I was actually at this stage. But obviously cyber risk in relation to the growth of digitalization is an increasingly important issue that the industry generally needs to face. My basic argument is that marine insurers at the moment, and I come from that particular side of our industry, are conscious of this to some extent, that in the ordinary way most marine hull and P&I covers will deal with accidental cyber risk as a matter of a covered risk. But if such a risk were to arise in the context of a war act or an act of terrorism, then that would be quite different. Yes. Thank you very much.
I did anyway. Thank you, Joe. I think now that you may wonder what all of us are up here for, because we're all talking about different and seemingly unrelated things, but in fact, they're not unrelated. These are among the challenges that the industry faces, and although they're coming from entirely different directions, our next speaker, who I'd like to call on Mr. Wei of BIMCO, I would like you to comment, if you could, as I may have indicated. BIMCO has a long and very distinguished history of creating documents for the maritime industry, and you alluded to that in the discussions that we had before we all got together here today by email. Can you hear me over there? Are there any problems from my colleagues in the National Registries? Okay, you can hear. One of the things that your documentary committee does, and indeed the whole of BIMCO, is produce standard contracts, forms, clauses, and the like for the shipping industry. And you've been doing that for well over 100 years. You just heard what Joe Hughes had to say, and you heard what the early other speakers had to say. The flood tide of regulation that is, and Henrietta took us through this very well during her presentation, that is now, I wouldn't say engulfing us, but is very much a part of the world in which we work and live, is undoubtedly going to result in a lot of changes in existing BIMCO documentation. While this may seem like a very dry subject, it is the lifeblood of a great deal of this industry. We heard from our distinguished speaker this morning from the city government that arbitration is a very important part of what you do. Well, arbitration is also a very important part of the clausing that BIMCO has drafted over many years in numerous charter parties and other documents. Again, it's a very much practical importance to all of us. Tell us, if you could, very briefly about what where you see BIMCO doing, and I would be particularly interested, because I follow the work of your documentation committee very closely. Where does the money come from going forward for the kind of work that BIMCO is going to have to be doing?
Thank you very much, Clay. Actually, I can brief because the time is limited. Actually, the money comes from actually thanks to our member their contribution, because BIMCO we collected their membership, and then we just as the benefit for industry we set up the documentary committee, and their mission actually is developing or revise the standard contracts or clauses, which is why they're used by the industry. And I would like to jump back a little bit to the topic here today. We are discussing about the geopolitical risks. One typical example which happened yesterday, if you look at the North Korea, they just the public criticized China's government. What the hell are you doing? So this is the political geopolitics is definitely impacted our industry. And I'm sure some of our Chinese colleagues, they have the bad bloody lessons in the middle of this year. I think it's the coal import has been completely blocked from North Korea to China. And it's triggered chaos. So this is the risk we have to face with and we try to deal with. And back to the BIMCO's documents, yes, we closely monitor what's going on with the regulation issues. And hopefully we would like to have the IMO as the unique platform where we will follow, because shipping is international. We don't want to see the regional or national regulations will make our problems. That is a huge challenge, which the typical example we see as the balance of water, and also the MRV could be the second one, and even the cybersecurity is premature now, but we will see. And the key issue, if we talk about the low sulfur, the cap, I think the key issue is how we could ensure the same level playing field. This is quite a challenge. Because in front of, there's two different kinds of the ship owner, if we're talking ship owner here. One is the compliant ship owner, the other is non-compliant ship owner. And how we could ensure and make sure that they will have the same level to compete with. There was two critical stages here. I think the first is how we could ensure unique the compliance. The second is how we could ensure that actually is the effective enforcement. That's why BIMCO, we strongly endorse, the MIPOD and Nexus, which encourage all the national, regional, the governing body to make sure the enforcement is robust and ensure enforcement is actually accepted to everybody. Otherwise, we will not achieve the sustainable development anyway. And as to our regulation side, the BIMCO documentary side, all of our practical clauses as well as the documents, we have to reflect this kind of practice into our daily chartering documents. That ranges from the bunker clauses, the veg oil clauses for time charter and the void charter, etc., etc. So that's the reality we're facing. We have to deal with. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, what I would like to do is ask Vincent. You represent and work for a very large classification society, and we're seeing a lot of change. We're seeing LNG come on, maybe as a fuel. It was the first LNG bunkering in Singapore was last week, I believe. One of the things that was almost a mantra for class societies, and yours in particular, is cost reductions through better design, new technology. You've heard about what's been discussed today, and we will discuss probably throughout the day on the tide of regulation. You asked a question when we communicated with each other. Do we meet that tide with retrofitting, scrapping, as I said, or purchase, or new building? What do you think?
I think it's an interesting question. From a class society, for sure that we always encourage new buildings. We actually help our business. But on the other hand, if we go back to history, look at the bunker when we come to the all-time high. A lot of owners, operators are driving towards slow steaming, and by doing slow steaming, they're retrofitting their ships in order to accommodate the cost saving. But today, if you look at all the new regulatory compliance that we've been discussing this morning, such as ballast water management and emission control and things like that, I see this is probably the second wave of moving towards another retrofitting, in order to preserve the asset value of your ships and also remain competitive in the market. Probably ballast water management is not something that nobody can resist, and it's a matter of how much you have to put into installing a new system. But on the emission control, probably there's a few alternatives, like using scrubbers, for example, or using low sulfur fuel, or maybe switch to LNG. But if it's existing ships, to shift to LNG probably is not a good idea at all. But all in all, this is very much depends on the fuel price level. You know, how does it go? So I don't think anybody has a crystal ball at all. However, what is the decision to make a decision on retrofitting your ship? I think there's a few areas you need to really take into considerations. For example, is age of your vessels. How long do you believe your vessel is going to run for the lifetime? Let's say, if you take an example that if your ship is 15 years old today, by 2022, ballast water management kicks in, then should you invest into it? By that time, your ship is already 20 years old. Would you be able to make the investment and operate for another 5 years? So this is all a matter of financial calculations. What kind of ROI you're going to get? On the other hand, I just talk about the fuel price. That's also something that you should look into. I don't think there's a formula to it. But if the fuel prices continues like to today's level, maybe retrofit is not something that you need to take into considerations.
You mean you're against retrofitting under the circumstance like that, or do you think it's maybe not such a good idea?
Depends on the age of the ship again. I mean, this is a combination of factors. Right? If the fuel price is staying stable, then retrofitting is a matter of how long you want to run the ship for.
We've got a lot of expertise in the audience. I see some people from Columbia Ship Management here. Does anybody want to tackle that question of what's the best course depending on the kind of ship? I realize it's a ridiculous question, by the way, but it's a question that provokes a lot of thought, particularly because of the supply of LNG in the world.
Yeah, I'm talking about existing ships.
You're talking about existing ships.
Yeah, existing ships. And also you need to take into consideration of the new building price too. If the new building price is staying in all-time low, then I mean, as low as today, whether we should look into getting new buildings in place of the putting additional investment into the existing vessels. Those are the few criteria I think we need to look into before we decide whether we should go for the.
Any questions from the floor? Looking around, I don't see any questions from the floor. Everybody looks very reserved. There is one on the end. We're getting to you. Tim.
Well, as people start considering what questions they can ask, just three things that spring to mind as my fellow panelists were talking. Firstly, on cyber and the administrative burden of new regulations. I think the cyber in particular, that does not lend itself to mandatory requirements, whether they're global or not. It simply is something that's changing too quickly. We talk about digitization, as Arjun pointed out, and I'm sitting next to my colleague here from BIMCO. INTERTANKO and BIMCO have worked very hard to ensure that the industry is issuing its own best practices on this, because they need to change. They need to change quickly. We know how slow IMO's process can be. That's one thing. Let's not try and move down that mandatory route. Point two is on this non-compliance with the 2020 thing. Now, we probably don't see it in the same way in regards to this concern over non-compliance. When ECA came in, we had about a 95% compliance rate in 2015. And I think those non-compliant elements, the 5%, it was marginal, and it was related to the supply of the fuel to those vessels. It was 0.1 or 0.09 or something like that, so it was very small non-compliance. What would overcome this, and as quite rightly pointed out by Wayne here, is if we get some form of responsibility by the suppliers. Make sure that the suppliers supply the correct fuel and the compliant fuel, then we will not have this concern over compliance. And finally, I think nobody's mentioned the issue of seafarers, Clay, on this panel yet.
No.
We have unfortunately mentioned unmanned vessels and autonomous vessels under the digitization aspect, but I think we have some much more near-term concerns in this industry, in particular for the tanker sector, where not just the shortage of seafarers in the future is a concern, but the competency of the seafarers that are coming out of the colleges and academies today, and whether or not they can meet the expectations, particularly for the tanker sector, in terms of competency. So I think that's something that perhaps we'd like to put a little marker in the sand for this panel as well. Thank you, John.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. And I think our time is up. Thank you very much. Let's give the panel a round of applause. I apologize for having made it so difficult for all of you. Thank you again for listening.